Hello and welcome to another edition of The Tigers Down Under, and what an episode we have in store today, I think. Joining me, as always, I have Dan. How are you, Dan?
Oh, I could certainly be better after the weekend, that's for sure.
And also joining us, we have Logan. How are you, mate?
I'm doing well, Alex. It's good to be back.
Yeah, it's certainly plenty to talk about, and we will start with probably the bigger news, arguably bigger news, I guess, which was the article by The Athletic, which dropped Monday night, our time, I think it was, which was pretty groundbreaking because I think it's probably the first time that the national press have really put such a magnifying glass on all of the actions of the Allams at the club. And the article itself is a really painful read because it all just rings completely true. But I guess the most fascinating aspect of it was the fact that the club itself sort of broke the news and in some ways actually offered up more of the dirty details than the article actually did, because their faulty redacting of the dot points didn't work out too well. But I'll start with you, Logan. I don't know if either of you have had the chance to read the article itself or just the dot points or a combination of the two. But Logan, reading through a lot of this information, how did it make you feel? And what did you make of the sort of, I guess, would you call them accusations or recounting of events?
Look, I think the one thing that it remains consistent in all of this, and it's very easy as football fans to be extremely irrational, and we set high expectations every week and hope that the team will go out and perform in a certain way. But as you mentioned, Alex, with that article, if we're going back to 2010, I believe, when the Allams took over, there has been this consistent pattern of they came in with this optimistic feel and everything was going to be rosy and they were there giving back to the community. And then we've seen that downward spiral. In that, it's worth mentioning, we have also had some incredible highs on the pitch, but the trustworthiness of the Allams entirely has got to the point where it's very difficult for even the most optimistic City supporter to still be on board with them. So I guess the first thing that you have to say about the article is when you're trusting reporters and papers with their information and almost assume that before the club says anything that there's an accuracy about that you would trust more than from the horse's mouth in your club. I think that probably sums up the state of affairs we're in. And if you go through the article, I'm sure that we will at length and pull out some of the key sticking points, things about player contracts and people being told to play for free and all those kind of finite details. It really just gives this snapshot of doom and gloom. And I mean, you see a lot of people on the forums talking about we're going down, but when you kind of take a step back and look at the whole picture, it's really hard to see anything but when you assume that the club is being run like a basket case. And you almost have to ask that question of the players: is what are they playing for?
Yeah, absolutely. As you sort of touched on there, the player contracts, in particular with Lehigh, Irvine, Kingsley, being told mid-session, I believe, last week that their services were no longer required by the club. Dan, sort of following on from that point from Logan about what are the players playing for, it's sort of ironic, I guess, when you look at the comments from McGann last week about, only wanting committed players at the club, leaving aside, and we'll talk about the game itself, leaving aside the fact he started 4 loan players, so you kind of question, well, where's their commitment to the club? But in terms of Lehigh, Irvine and Kingsley, what do you sort of make of this information about the fact that they were basically asked to play for free and then sacked mid-session during training?
Yeah, it's not a good look, is it? Like, to be honest, like we mentioned it last week about them being, the club captain, the vice captain, our longest serving player, and just to be let go so unceremoniously, like in that fashion, that I'm pretty sure I read, like the playing, like no one had any idea that was happening. That like the bosses turn up and everyone's training, and then all of a sudden, pull the captain and the vice captain aside and they pack their bags and go. Like it's pretty harsh. And it's sort of like Logan was saying that even the most optimistic of supporters are, going to find it hard to find the positives in this whole scenario. And I'm sitting there going, yeah, you're pretty right, because I think I've been pretty lenient on the Allams as a whole. I think, like, throughout this, I've tried to give them the benefit of the doubt probably more often than was deserved. But I think as you point out, Alex, when you read through some of this information that's come out, it really is it's just damning. And like, I think the fact that they're banning the press, like, that's like a big, that's a point where that they know they're doing the wrong thing. They know they're doing things that they don't need, that they don't want to get reported. And so the not necessarily the only paper, but that the whole, Daily Mail's trying to do the right thing. They're trying to, report on what's happening, and that's being classed as negative media, which is, it's just insanity on so many levels. Like, we've talked about the way they go about re-signing players, and that same like system where we have lots and lots of players, all of their deals expiring at the same time, and that leads to mass losses at the end of the season, or like an exodus of players. And we do this over and over and over. And again, like, that definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. And that's pretty much, it just seems to be Allam House to a T.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think all of us, and I guess we've got that benefit of distance, that we can probably more rationally than some in the UK try and assess things with some level of balance. And I would say this podcast is generally quite positive. We always do try and look for the reasons of why things would be done a particular way. We'll look at why the concessions were scrapped. We'll look at why they were charging for the streaming service as recently as last week. So I think we've always been quite fair in that sense, or some would say too fair to the Allams. But then when we do occasionally encroach on negativity, much like the Hull Daily Mail, that would be viewed as negative press. So at the end of the day, the Hull Daily Mail are a newspaper. They're meant to be reporting the facts. They're meant to be reporting the situation. If that's positive, it's great. If it's negative, it's not so great. And they have to do their jobs. And to be in an organisation that's effectively banned the free press, that's bordering on a dictatorial state. So, I guess for me, the most alarming story, or one of the most alarming, I mean, there was a lot of alarming stories in there, but one of the most alarming stories about the state of the relationship between Ehab and Steve Bruce back in 2016 was when one of Bruce's backroom staff had, I think it came out to he had a sick mother. I think she had cancer or something like that. I don't think the details are that necessary, but he wanted to take leave to look after her. And Bruce said, yep, that's fine, paid leave, all of that, as is right. And Ehab tried to get the kid to take unpaid leave. And Ehab actually, in the midst of that argument, sacked Bruce, and of course then later unsacked him. But it just sort of speaks to the mindset of the man that, somebody wanting to take sick leave to look after their mother, or take, carer's leave to look after their mother, was denied a wage in doing so. Logan, that story in particular, other stories, what shocked you most out of the article?
Look, I don't know if I'm going on a segue here, but I just, while we're on the whole Australian angle and how you mentioned about being, disconnected somewhat, although we obviously wake up at unruly hours to be able to watch the games. I think for me, there was a personal disappointment when I saw the announcement that Jackson Irvine in particular wasn't returning to play. And
didn't get a farewell game.
And my initial response was, that's got to be something on his end, or whether it was chasing money. And I kind of felt a little bit stupid about it when I took a step back and realized, well, actually, that's not the kind of player that we know, particularly here from how we've seen him in the Socceroos. I mean, with all due respect to Jackson Irvine, he's a workman. He's a hard-working player, and he's definitely got caliber that suits the championship. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, he's not anywhere near the caliber of player that we have had at City in recent times. If you compare him to a a Snodgrass, a Bowen Grzycki, and Andes, whoever those main stars are. And it's the fact now that we've actually moved on from even forgetting about those big stars and knowing that they're no longer part of the city plans. But even someone like Jackson Irvine, who, as we said, has, had endeared himself to the whole fans and had even reached the captaincy standpoint, for him to be, grouped into those contracts, it tells us a lot about the situation, because we have that familiarity with the type of player he is. Yeah. And we know he is the type of player who will just roll his sleeves up and get the job done. So if even he's been turned away, that's kind of the telltale sign for me, just to show all of us just how bad the state is that the club really is being run in. And another thing that actually concerns me more is the amount of times we've become familiar with Ehab coming out and making one of those announcements and putting together one of those 10 or 15 minute videos talking about bridging the gap with the fans and wanting to put the past behind them. And then something like this comes out, and it is just another nail in the coffin of the city dream of the club at present, just overall. But certainly staying up just feels like the truly impossible task, when it's almost like we've lost the culture. It's not that we've lost the playing group, and that's a really sad state of affairs.
And it was interesting. I think it was Richard Gardam, the author of, I'm going to forget the name of it now. It's a great book, and I'm going to keep myself that I've forgotten it. The Decade, of course. Author of The Decade was tweeting about all of this and how sad it made him feel. And I responded, and it was, in a way, a really interesting sort of occurrence where reading this article, reading all of this fallout, made me so angry at the club. And I realised this is the most angry I've been about football, the most frustrated, the most angry I've been about football in a long time. And as disappointed as I was with the match against Charlton on the weekend, I think it was more it's a disappointment, but it's not a surprising result that we had on the weekend. So it's almost as if the failings of the club, or the lack of success at the club, has become so ingrained that we just sort of accept it, and it's just unsurprising to us that it takes something like this to really jolt you out of that and realize, hang on, I've just become accustomed to this. I've become so apathetic to this situation. It takes something like this to really make you feel anger and make you feel something again. And it's just an incredible situation, because you always think, and there's been so many of these situations, we always think nothing could surprise us about the Allams now. And then there's always something new that does take us to that next level of anger and frustration at their ownership. Another story that kind of jumped out at me was with Marco Silva, where Ehab sort of bragged about, especially when we were looking at hiring Leonard Slutsky, he sort of bragged about the fact that he was not going for the merry-go-round of English has-beens in management, and that he was looking further afield, and pointing to Silva as this big success story that he'd brought into the club. And we find out that Silva actually applied for the job shortly after Bruce left, and his application was just completely ignored until his agent personally travelled up to Yorkshire and basically pled his case to Ehab in person. And even then, the deal almost fell over because they tried to underpay the agent. And it was only... some of these stories, you almost think, how much worse could we have been if not for, some other people being incredibly patient and incredibly willing to work with Ehab, more so than you'd think is reasonable. Dan, what do you make of stories like that?
I don't know, when I see that, like particularly about Silva, I think if he'd have come in at the beginning of that season, I reckon we would have survived. We would have stayed in the Premier League that year. Such was his impact in the 6 months that he was there. He almost managed it in such dire straits that we were then. He almost managed to... we only need to pick up a couple of extra wins out of those games, and there were many winnable games in that first half of the season. But things like that blow my mind. But I think generally, and there was like even the with the takeover in 2016 and Peter Greaves, and then Assam just basically went, I think I don't actually really want to sell the club.
Yeah.
So that
so it's actually, you talk about that Premier League season. And we were sort of talking about it in the chat the other night. But you almost wonder, should we more of hope to lose that final at Wembley? Would actually not making it to the Premier League have been better off if he would have actually sold the club?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it makes for an interesting, an interesting talking point. I guess it's one of those, we'll never really know, but it's probably a valid argument about and a valid question that he, without going up and without then reaping the rewards again of the Premier League, that perhaps had we not come into all that extra money, maybe he could have had his head turned enough to relinquish the club. But it seems to be this weird, I don't know, maybe it's still just, I don't know, naivety on my part or something, but it seems like there's a big, even between Assam and Ehab, this huge disparity in their actions towards and opinions about the club. Seems like they're obviously together, but they seem like you see what the things that the one says and then the things that the other do, and they don't necessarily always seem to line up perfectly, if you know what I mean. It's just strange. I don't know, maybe he's, I don't know. I don't know.
And I guess before we move on to the game, and I guess this question sort of feeds into that anyway, but I'll ask each of you, I guess starting with Logan, if we are to get relegated to League One, do you see the Allams as still sort of clinging on to the club? Because we sort of, in the group, talked about the fact that with things like this and becoming so much more of a quote-unquote banter club, it feels like we're a new Blackpool in the sense that the owners just absolutely despise the club, despise the fans, and just want to see it suffer. Do you see them hanging on to the club even in League One, or do you think the complete lack of money in League One, the complete lack of any television money, parachute payments or anything, would mean that the fact that they'd then be digging into their own pockets just to fund the club, do you think that could force them to finally sell?
I think the only thing that we can predict in this situation is that it's going to be horrific. It's going to be predictably bad, and it's like only the Allams can do is they can turn something that seemingly looks so positively into something that can just be discarded as proper waste. So whatever they end up doing with it, it will be done in a horrific manner. However, I do think that the latter, as you mentioned, I think they will actually finally move on from the club once, if the fate in League One is sealed, and there just won't be the funding. I think if we're actually to be realistic around the money that they've recouped from the players that have been sold, it probably is enough of a position for them to cut their losses, whatever they claim those losses are, and walk. So I think if we do get relegated, they will be gone.
What do you think, Dan?
Yeah, I'd have to agree. Whatever they reckon that the club owes them at the moment in terms of finances, if we go down, the chances of them, they're going to essentially just have to cut their, hopefully, fingers. It seems weird to be saying fingers crossed that we go down and we get new owners, but they're saying, the club still owes us whatever it is, £30 million or something. That's how much we put in that we want back, as Logan was sort of alluding to in terms of finances in the different divisions, if we go, it's just not there in League One, and they're not going to be able to recoup, and it's just going to be they're just going to be spending. So I feel like that's probably where they'll hopefully that's where they'll be at. If we get relegated, I mean, hopefully they just cut their losses either way. That would be preferential, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I saw one of the responses to the article was somebody saying, well, at least you're not a Sunderland supporter, and I think I'd be quite happy to be a Sunderland supporter next season in comparison to where I think we will be. But yeah, I think it'll be a very interesting situation. There's still, I guess the way they could look at it is, look, there's still some players at the club with some value. You've got Device, you've got Keane Lewis Potter, Lopez, things like that, where they could potentially get a fee for them, but I think at that point you're sort of clutching at straws if you're holding on to the club just for those final few players. But we will move on and talk about the result on the weekend, which was a very, very, very disappointing loss to Charlton in a 1-0 defeat. And I think probably the most disappointing aspect was that it was 1-0. It wasn't even 2-1 or something like that. I can't remember the stat, but it's been quite a while since we've scored a goal even, and it just looks like we can't even muster up a decent showing against a fellow relegation candidate at home. So I'll start with you, Logan. I guess any positives to take out of the game? Any players that looked good? I think probably the story of McDonald starting is a pretty good one.
Yeah, that was probably all I was going to say. That's the golden cheek in what was otherwise an incredibly dire performance. But yeah, having McDonald back, I mean, I guess we thought and we kind of rode that battle with him as he was diagnosed with cancer, and to see a player return in reasonably quick fashion, given the fact of the severities, it was fantastic effort and probably a testament to how hard he's worked behind the scenes. And so to see that there's players of his caliber with his work ethic to be able to overcome such a traumatic experience and health scare and risk to return in the way he did, I think that was definitely the only positive that can be taken away from Saturday.
Dan, did you have any other positives, or just McDonald?
Look, I actually think Bowler actually played really well. Apart from if he had end product, I would rate him about a 7 or 8 out of 10 for the game.
Yeah.
But he was just so wasteful at almost he got in behind so many times and that was really good. And that was really that he was the most dynamic player in that aspect for an extended period of the game. You know, Terrell started the first 5 or 10 minutes and pulled them apart, and then I think they just moved a player onto him and he was completely taken out of the game, which was very disappointing. But yeah, I think apart from McDonald, I thought Bowler was good, but lacking end product. I think what was good about my take on McDonald was that after so long, you could actually see that he was rusty, but he still looked way better than half of our team.
Yeah.
Like, he hasn't played in like 2 years and he still was one of the best on the park. So, you know, if he can actually stay in there and get a run of these last few games, he could be a crucial cog in our wheel.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think grasping at straws a little bit, but probably the only other positives I could draw were that I thought Scott looked really good when he came on, as did Samuelson. Both probably a little bit rusty, similar to McDonald, but I think Wilkes was a really strange one, especially if we're not going to keep him beyond this Birmingham game. I sort of alluded to before, if McGann's big thing is, you know, having players that want to be here, and granted Wilkes might want to be here, but if he's not going to be a City player after the Birmingham game, I think we need to be focusing on the players that will be here and getting a sort of consistent side out. One question I had for both of you, I guess, is what did you make of the fact that we could make 5 subs? Because personally, I felt like it almost worked against us, because I don't know whether it meant that McGann might have started with players who he planned to sub off at a particular point, or maybe more so with someone like a Scott or a Lewis Potter. He deliberately started them on the bench knowing he could bring them on. It almost felt like it disrupt, not that we had much rhythm to begin with, but it disrupted any sort of rhythm that we were going to be able to get, because 5 subs, you're basically changing half your team. Logan, did you see any sort of impact from that?
In the particular Charlton game, it didn't worry me too much, and I didn't really feel that there was a huge impact in the game. With that being said, it does concern me moving forward. I genuinely think that with the lack of depth that we do have at City, and likelihood that Terrell will probably find himself injured this weekend, as he often does, it does concern me that some of the games for the run in may actually leave us very thin, when you consider that some of the teams that we will be playing will have far deeper squads than us, and we may be hurt as a result.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I hadn't even thought of it from that perspective. Yeah, I mean, if teams are able to bring on talented, fresh players to run at us in the final 15 minutes or 20 minutes, we're going to be in a bit of trouble. Dan, how did you see it? And I guess the rotations in the side in that second half?
Yeah, I don't know. I think, like, as sort of Logan said, like, in terms of in the context of that game, did it have an impact, positive or negative? Not really. It just sort of seemed like it was something that happened. It really felt like watching a preseason game. Like, it was we were just really, really average. I think in a different game, and I think it could have a really big impact on the game. But that depends on McCann either forcing it to, like, or forcing it to have that impact one way or the other. And I don't know whether really actually does have the tactical nous to pull that off. It felt like earlier in the season when we had a decent run going that maybe he did have a bit of, but I think now we can basically see it was Bowen and Grzycki were just carrying us along on their shoulders or coattails, whichever you want. But and now we're really starting to see since January how, like, I like McCann, but how, like, tactically inept he seems to be. He seems unwilling to make change to the structure of the system. Seems basically unwilling to change. Like, he's picked the 11 that he wants basically, and if form be damned, essentially. So yeah, I don't know if he's ever going to be able to make the most of it. I think there are definitely managers in the championship who will be able to take advantage of that 5 subs. Obviously relying on things like depth, like that Logan mentioned, but yeah, I don't know. I guess it's an interesting experiment. I can't see them extending it beyond this season. It's obviously just special circumstance, but
yeah. And then I guess, so Logan, what was probably the most frustrating aspect of the game for you? What frustrated you the most in this one?
Yeah, I think Dan touched on it before with Josh Bowler, with just some of the positions that we were able to kind of get ourselves into, and then the end product was just lacking. He, as Dan mentioned as well, that it felt like a preseason game, every aspect, and let's remember that Charlton weren't great. In fact, they were dismal, and to be able to come to the KCOM and sneak a result probably lends more to just how poor Weep were than how good they were, because I certainly think they were far from it, and they did look like a team that is also struggling for survival. But I think that if there is anything to take out of it, one of the things that confuses me greatly is the presence of George Honeyman. I don't see what the appeal is, and
yeah.
I think back to
he's a bundle of energy, but doesn't really do much with it.
I think back to the success earlier in the season, and granted, we did have Bowen and Grzycki who were largely responsible for that. But one thing that we were sleeping on is the ability of Stewart to pop up in midfield, and I think he was leading the championship for interceptions at that time, and it was just that free-flowing play of being able to change the momentum, steal the ball, and find those wide outlets. And we really captured teams on the back foot. And I just can't see how, playing through Honeyman, we're going to be able to foster anything of the like. And as Dan mentioned, there is players like Bowler and Samuelson who may be the type of players who can get into those areas. But it certainly concerns me what's happening, particularly in the spine of our side at the moment.
Yeah, I think following on from that point, for me, it was seeing Eves dropping into that space in front of Terrell, and then Kane later in the game, where he was just sort of getting in the way of our midfield and was just so ineffective. And you want your striker, especially a big striker, to be on the end of the crosses and in the box, getting on the end of chances, and he just wasn't able to do that at all. He just had a really, probably one of the worst games that I've seen Eves play for the club, and I don't mean that with any disrespect, because I really like Eves and really rate him, but it was just a really disappointing game from him. Dan, what was your most disappointing aspect of the game?
I think honestly just the manner in which we conceded. Like, it was such an easily defendable,
so predictable.
Yes, easily defendable, so
set
predictable
piece.
That we would concede from a set piece in such a manner that Long comes, flaps at the cross and pushes it, straight into the striker. Our man on the back post charges off away from his position, and then they're able to tap it in, like, behind him, and you go, what? It blew my mind watching it, and then I saw the replay and just watched everything unfold in slow motion, and it was like dominoes, just like one thing led to the next, and you're going, how do they not see this? Like, when they, after the games, how do they not go into a room with a coach who goes, see how you ran off the line here? That's where you made your mistake. Next time, just stay in your position.
Yeah.
Like, because they do it all the time. It's like every time we concede off a corner, it's almost the exact same thing, and it's so frustrating. That was what did it for me.
Fair enough. We do have Birmingham this week, so it is a chance to right the wrongs, but we seem not to be able to do that lately, as you're sort of alluding to there, Dan. Interestingly, they don't have any wins in their last 5 games, but they do have 4 draws in that time, one of which was last weekend against West Brom, so a pretty reasonable team to pick up a point against. Decent firepower up top as well with Scott Hogan and Utowicz, if I'm pronouncing that right, who've both been pretty prolific. Hogan more so with Brentford and Villa, I guess, than with Birmingham. And they've got Jude Bellingham in midfield, who I don't know if he'll actually play because I know he's in the process of sealing a deal to Borussia Dortmund. It's a rather talented 16-year-old, but they have some pretty decent quality all through the lines, I guess, is the biggest issue against them this week. I guess starting with you, Logan, what sort of changes would you like to see in the team, and how do you think we'll go against Birmingham?
I think that earlier you mentioned the idea of if McCann does want these players who want to be there, it's going to be very difficult to justify starting all these loan players. Wilkes is an interesting one, so I guess that whether they decide to look at getting the last game out of him or, kind of letting him fester because they know that he's not going to be part of the plans moving forward, that would be an interesting one to see. I would love to see Stewart come into play. I think that is crucial, and obviously if Lopez is back, then he, for me, instantly starts. So to see those two come in, Stewart and Lopez, would make a world of difference. And I would love to see Ken Lewis-Potter start as well.
Yeah, we didn't really touch on that with the Charlton game, that both Lopez and Stewart sat out, which obviously had a massive impact on our strength through midfield. I think Lopez just missed with illness. I don't quite know what the story was with Stewart. Of course, with the Athletic article that came out with suggestions as he's our highest player, so I'd kind of try not to. I'd hope that the owners aren't making him sit out games just because of his wage or anything as silly as that, but I guess you never really know. Dan, how would you like to see the side changed up for this game?
There'd be a few changes, I think. Look, I think based on the Charlton game, Ken Lewis-Potter, James Scott came on. Maybe still lacked a bit of, finesse in and end product, but they absolutely were throwing themselves at balls in the box. And Samuelson was getting through that pretty in that area as well. I think we have to make some changes in the forward line. I think Wilkes, if he'd played really well on the weekend and had a huge impact and won us the game, I could maybe say, sure, let's play him for the last game and get what we can out of him, milk him for what he's worth. But had an appalling game on the weekend and did almost absolutely nothing. So I think just put him on the sideline and just let him go back to Barnsley next week. I think in terms of Lopez and Stewart, I think absolutely Kane for me doesn't really do. He's there, and but he doesn't really seem to do anything special. He kind of reminds me of, like, in terms of his distribution and the things that he does, he's a slightly better Honeyman, I guess. Like, he doesn't do as much up and down running and wild, but he's still not great in terms of his passing, I don't think. So I think.
Would either of you consider a change of formation, or do you think that's too bold for McCann to try?
I'd love to see a change of formation. I don't see McCann doing it though. Unfortunately, he's really set on his 4-3-3, so I think we'll see a 4-3-3 on the weekend. I think the back four will probably be the same that we saw on the weekend. I can't see any reason to bring Burke in place of McDonald. As much as I liked the Burke-Device partnership, I think McDonald and Device was just as effective. So I think the changes would be in that midfield. I'd bring in Lopez and Stewart if they're both available. And then in a front three, I'd probably throw KLP, Ken Lewis-Potter and James Scott on the wings, and then flip a coin for probably based on the weekend, Magennis was slightly better than Eves. So I'd probably go KLP, Magennis and James Scott as my front three.
Would you agree on that front three, Logan, or who would you want to say up top?
I would be happy with that front three. I think that arguably it's hard to see where the goals are coming from, and that's largely because of the lack of quality we have in our build-up play. So, I mean, speculating on who plays in those front three positions, maybe even a step too far at the moment. It feels like there's a lot more other things that need to be fixed first before we're going to be able to be productive with particularly in the goal scoring ranks. But just to see something different, I think is crucial this weekend. We've become very predictable. We've become very lackluster and just mistake riddled. And I think that if we're not to try something new now, I just can't see how we're going to be able to rectify the current slide.
It's almost hard to believe that when we faced Birmingham earlier in the season, that was, I believe it was a 3-0 win where KLP scored the sealer at the end of that game with such a composed finish at the KCOM. So to go from, it's truly a season of two halves, and I still struggle to believe the fact that on New Year's Day when we won against Sheffield Wednesday, we were 1 point outside the playoffs and haven't won since. So it's a bit depressing looking back at fixtures from the first half of that season. But yeah, look, I probably agree with both of you. I mean, my wishful thinking is I'd love to see a change in formation, but I agree with Dan that, McGann loves his 4-3-3. He's going to stick to his 4-3-3. And look, if Lopez and Stewart are both fit, I'd love to see them both come into the side. KLP, Scott, and probably McGann starting up top is our best option for the side, because I think Scott has had his game to sort of bed into the side and start to adapt to the championship, but we've only got 8 games left. Time's running out. We need to be sort of putting all our chips on the table and like you say, sort of going for it. And look, if we go out in Birmingham and lose the game 3-2. I'd probably accept that over another 1-0 loss, or even I'd probably take a 0-0 draw because I'd take the point. But you know what I mean? Like I'd rather see us going out there and trying, even if it does mean we're conceding a couple of goals.
Yeah, I think that's all we really want at this stage. All we can ask for really is we just want them to look like they actually It's one of those things we know. We know that there's a joke, and they are trying out there. I'm not going to sit here and say that they're not trying, but it just doesn't seem to be working, and I just want, just an extra little bit from them.
And then just quickly before we sign off, thoughts, Logan, on Middlesbrough appointing Neil Warnock? Do you think that sort of basically takes away a side from this relegation fight, or do you sort of wish that we would follow their lead and do something similar, or how did you see that one?
I think that it's exactly what we're talking about with putting our chips on the table and trying something new. I think that is Middlesbrough have got to that point where they've realised where the position that they sit isn't good enough, and if they don't change something, they'll consider themselves continuing their slide. So I think it's very proactive from their management and from the club to actually go and get Warnock, who is a proven manager at this level, and I think he's probably a pretty good bet that he will get Borough out of the slide. And I would be very surprised to see if at the end of the season they're in those final 3 places.
I quite liked his comment that he'll enjoy the fact that he has 8 games without fans booing him in the stadium, which he's always been quite an honest manager in that sense. Dan, what did you make of the appointment?
I think just like Logan, it's a good proactive decision. I guess we'll just see how it pays off for them. But I think if they're at least willing to take that chance and make a change at this stage, knowing that they haven't been performing well enough, then I think they are on the right track and they probably actually deserve to avoid relegation in that sense.
And then a score prediction from you, Dan?
Oh, I don't know. I was really optimistic last week, and now I'm not. It's so hard. I don't know if we produce anything like we did last week, and based on the last 12 games or whatever that we've played, we probably will. I think we will lose again, and we'll just mire ourselves further in the relegation. Probably another frustrating, shitty 1-0 loss.
What about you, Logan?
Yeah, it's hard to see it falling any other way. I think that
Yeah.
if it's not 1-0 against us, I think it could be 2 or 3. But I just don't know where our goals are going to come from.
The one little bit of silver lining, I saw a really interesting tweet from a Birmingham supporter who said that they as a club, they're always that club that apparently, because I always feel like it's us, but they're always the club apparently who loses to the club in crisis. So they're always the ones that give that club in crisis a kickstart. So I'm hoping that rings true. I'm hoping we come away with a scrappy 1-0 90th minute KLP goal. But I mean, that's with a very optimistic hat on. So hopefully the Allams don't ban me from the training ground. I'm being optimistic. I'm not being negative. But we'll see what happens on the weekend, and I guess keep our fingers crossed. But until then, thanks for joining us tonight, Logan.
Yeah, no worries. It might be our last podcast if some of the things we've said get taken down. So if it is, it's been a good ride.
It's been a good ride indeed, and thanks for joining us as well, Dan.
My pleasure as always, Alex.
No worries. Cheers, everyone, for listening in. Hopefully, this has been a pretty interesting and lively episode of the Tigers Down Under. And until next time, come on, City. You've been listening to the official Hull City Australia podcast. For more discussion, join us on Facebook in the Hull City AFC Australian Supporters Group, or follow us on Twitter at Hull City AFC Oz. The music was created by Amber and Black.
Going higher and higher. There's no turning back 'cause you're